coldest inhabited point on the planet, there's a small heated building where, on a July night in 1983, a thermometer recorded something that had never been recorded anywhere on Earth before or since. Minus 89.2 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, exposed skin begins to develop frostbite in under 30 seconds. Boiling water thrown into the air turns into ice crystals before it hits the ground. And yet, on that same night, inside that same station, people were sleeping in their bunks, eating dinner in a mess hall, and going about a version of ordinary life that had almost nothing in common with the apocalyptic cold sitting on the other side of the wall. That's the strange truth at the center of Antarctica. It has no cities, no roads connecting one place to another, no permanent population, and no single square meter of land that belongs to any nation on Earth. And yet, scattered across this frozen continent, roughly 4,000 people are living there right now, cooking meals, running experiments, repairing engines, falling in love, getting into arguments about whose turn it is to do the dishes. Inside a landscape actively trying to kill anything that isn't specifically built to survive it. One of them, decades ago, had to cut his own appendix out with a mirror and a local anesthetic because there was no other doctor within 1,000 miles. One research station is built to walk, and an entire crew, right now, is living in a way so close to what astronauts experience on their way to Mars that the European Space Agency studies them instead of running its own simulation. This isn't a story about ice. It's a story about what people are willing to build and become in order to live somewhere the planet never intended for anyone to stay. Start with the number that makes everything else on this continent make sense. 0. Zero indigenous population. Zero permanent residents. 0 cities, 0 farms, 0 borders that any government fully controls. Because under the 1959 Antarctic Treaty, the entire continent is set aside for peaceful scientific use. Its sovereignty claims frozen in a kind of diplomatic stalemate that has held for over 60 years. Everyone who lives in Antarctica is, by definition, temporary. Even the people who spend decades of their working lives returning season after season are, technically, visitors, guests in a place that offers no permanent welcome to anyone. That's what makes the interior of the continent, and specifically the region around Russia's Vostok station, worth starting with. Vostok sits on the East Antarctic ice sheet at an elevation of nearly 3,500 meters, more than 1,000 kilometers from the nearest coast, in a location so isolated and so consistently cold that meteorologists refer to the surrounding region as the southern pole of cold. On the night of the 21st of July, 1983, the temperature there dropped to minus 89.2 degrees Celsius, a reading that has stood, unbeaten, for more than 40 years, and remains the lowest natural surface temperature ever directly measured anywhere on the planet. To put that number in context, it's colder than the average surface temperature recorded on Mars. The station's overwintering crew, typically somewhere between 10 and 25 scientists and support staff, spend roughly 8 months of the year almost completely cut off from the outside world because no aircraft can safely land or take off once winter temperatures fall past a certain threshold. During the coldest stretches, going outside without extreme precautions isn't just uncomfortable. It's a medical emergency waiting to happen. Exposed skin can suffer frostbite within 30 seconds, and breathing the outside air directly, without a mask or scarf to pre-warm it, risks cold injuring the lungs within minutes. Vostok's crew live almost their entire winter inside a heated, self-contained shell, venturing out only in short, carefully timed bursts to maintain instruments or perform essential outdoor tasks, dressed in multiple insulated layers that still can't fully guarantee protection against air this hostile. What makes Vostok worth the risk isn't the record-breaking cold itself. It's what that cold has preserved. Since the 1990s, researchers at the station have drilled more than 3.5 kilometers down through the ice sheet, extracting a continuous ice core that holds a climate record stretching back over 420,000 years. Trapped air bubbles, volcanic ash layers, and chemical signatures that let scientists reconstruct the Earth's atmosphere and temperature across 4 separate ice ages, long before any human civilization existed to record them another way. Vostok isn't just the coldest inhabited place on the planet. It's a physical archive of the planet's entire climate history. And the people who winter there are, in effect, living inside the world's most extreme filing cabinet, guarding a record that took hundreds of thousands of years to write, and that can never be recreated anywhere else. That combination, a place too hostile to casually inhabit, made worthwhile only by what it can teach, repeats itself in a completely different form. Roughly 1,700 kilometers away, on a floating ice shelf where the ground itself refuses to stay still, the British Antarctic Survey has operated a research station on the Brunt Ice Shelf on Antarctica's Weddell Sea coast since the 1950s. 5 separate stations have occupied that stretch of coastline over the decades, and every single one of the first 5 met the same fate. They were either crushed by the slow, relentless pressure of accumulating snow, or abandoned outright when the moving ice shelf beneath them threatened to carry the entire building out to sea. The problem Bass kept running into wasn't a design flaw. It was the ground itself. The Brunt Ice Shelf isn't solid Earth. It's a floating slab of ice, roughly 150 meters thick, constantly flowing outward toward the ocean at a rate of hundreds of meters a year, riddled with slow-growing cracks, called chasms, that can, without warning, widen into a full break and release an iceberg the size of a small city. So when engineers designed the 6th station on this site, Halley 6, they stopped trying to fight that problem and built a station specifically to live with it instead. Each of Halley 6's 8 modules sits on a set of massive hydraulic legs, and each leg ends in a giant steel ski. The hydraulics let the entire station mechanically climb upward every year to stay above the 1.5 meters of snowfall that accumulates annually on the ice shelf. Without that adjustment, earlier stations had simply been buried alive over time. And when the ice itself becomes the threat, rather than the snow piling on top of it, the skis let the whole station be disconnected, lowered onto the ice, and physically towed to safer ground. In the summer of 2017, that theoretical capability became a real, 13-week operation. British Antarctic Survey teams spent nearly 3 months hauling all 8 of Halley 6 modules 23 kilometers inland, away from a chasm that had begun growing dangerously close to the station's original site, relocating an entire functioning research base, rather than losing it the way its 5 predecessors had been lost. It's the first fully relocatable, permanently staffed research station ever built on Antarctica. A building engineered with the explicit assumption that the ground beneath it cannot be trusted to hold still, and that survival, in a place like this, sometimes means designing your home to walk away from danger, rather than simply enduring it in place. In summer, the station houses around 52 staff. In the depths of winter darkness, when resupply becomes essentially impossible, that number drops to a skeleton crew of roughly 16, living inside a set of connected modules perched on skis, on a slab of ice that is, at this very moment, still quietly drifting toward the sea. If Halley 6 represents Antarctica forcing humans to rethink what a stable home even means, station on this continent represents something even stranger. A place where scientists have deliberately chosen the harshest possible conditions, not despite the difficulty, but specifically because of it. Concordia Station sits on the Dome Sea Plateau in the interior of East Antarctica, jointly run by the French and Italian Polar Institutes, at an elevation of 3,200 meters. where winter temperatures regularly plunge below -80 degrees Celsius, and the sun disappears below the horizon completely for 4 straight months. Once the last flight of the season departs, usually in February, no aircraft can reach Concordia again until the following November. For roughly 9 months, the 12 to 16 people who choose to winter over are as physically cut off from the rest of humanity as it's possible to be while still standing on Earth's surface. More isolated, in fact, than the astronauts currently living aboard the International Space Station, who can at least count on a resupply mission arriving within weeks if something goes seriously wrong. At Concordia, if something goes wrong in June, the nearest help, at Russia's Vostok station, is still 600 kilometers away, across terrain no vehicle can safely cross in the dark. This is exactly why the European Space Agency pays such close attention to what happens there. Since the mid-2000s, ESA has sponsored a research physician to live at Concordia through the winter, specifically to study how the human body and mind respond to conditions that mirror, more closely than almost anywhere else on the planet, what a crew traveling to Mars would eventually face. Total physical isolation, a sharply reduced oxygen environment at altitude, months without natural daylight, a complete inability to abort the mission if something goes wrong, and a small, multicultural crew forced to share close quarters with people they may not have known well before arriving. Researchers studying the crew's sleep patterns have documented measurable disruptions to circadian rhythm caused by the prolonged darkness. Subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice the shift day to day, but persistent enough, over 4 straight months without sunlight, to leave a lasting mark on mood, alertness, and the overall psychological texture of a winter spent almost entirely under artificial light. ESA doesn't run this research as a curiosity. It runs it because Concordia is, quite literally, the closest thing on Earth to a rehearsal for interplanetary travel, and every crew member who winters there is, whether they think about it in these terms or not, standing in for a future astronaut on a 9-month trip to somewhere no aircraft can reach at all. Every place on this continent eventually forces the same question onto the people who choose to live there. What happens when something goes wrong, and there's genuinely no way to get outside help in time? Nowhere in Antarctica's history has that question been answered more directly than at a small Soviet station on the opposite side of the continent in the winter of 1961. Leonid Rogozov was 27 years old, the sole physician assigned to a 13-man Soviet expedition at Novolazarevskaya station, when, on the night of April 29th, he began experiencing nausea, fever, and a sharp pain low on the right side of his abdomen. As a trained surgeon, he recognized the symptoms almost immediately. Acute appendicitis. In any hospital anywhere else on Earth, this would have been a routine, low-risk procedure. At Novolazarevskaya, in the depths of the Antarctic autumn, it was closer to a death sentence. There was no other doctor on the continent close enough to reach him. No aircraft could fly in the deteriorating polar weather. Rogozov calculated that he had, at most, 2 or 3 days before his appendix would rupture, triggering peritonitis that, untreated, in this location, would almost certainly kill him. So, on the night of April 30th, with a meteorologist named Alexander Artemayev holding surgical instruments, and a mechanical engineer named Zinovy Teplinsky angling a mirror and a lamp so he could see his own abdomen, Rogozov injected himself with local anesthetic, made a 12-centimeter incision into his own body, and began searching, partly by sight in the mirror's reflection and partly by feel, for his own inflamed appendix. The operation took roughly 2 hours. Partway through, exhausted and fighting waves of dizziness from blood loss and the sheer physical strain of operating on himself in a semi-reclined position, he was forced to pause and rest before continuing. His 2 assistants, by every account of that night, came close to fainting more than once simply watching. Rogozov did not. He located the appendix, removed it, and closed the incision himself. Within 2 weeks, he had returned to his regular duties at the station. The story became international news almost immediately, not as a piece of Cold War propaganda, but as a genuinely unprecedented case in the history of medicine, a trained surgeon performing major abdominal surgery on his own body, guided only by a mirror, a local anesthetic, and the knowledge that there was no other option available to him. In the years that followed, the incident directly reshaped Soviet Antarctic policy, prompting new requirements for expanded medical training and equipment at remote stations, because Rogozov's experience had proven, in the most dramatic way imaginable, exactly how thin the margin for error becomes when a continent this remote is the only hospital you have. That thin margin sits underneath every single detail of ordinary life on this continent, even in the places designed to feel almost normal. And it's worth being honest about how deliberately engineered that normalcy actually is. At the largest research stations, particularly the United States' McMurdo Station on Ross Island, the summer population can swell past 1,000 people, supporting infrastructure that includes multiple dormitory buildings, a firehouse, a chapel, several dining facilities, and even a bar, all connected by roads that, for a few months a year, make the place function less like a scientific outpost and more like a small, snowbound American town. But the social order inside that town runs on rules that most towns back home don't follow. A world-renowned climate scientist and a first-season kitchen worker will often be assigned the exact same rotating chore of cleaning shared spaces. A duty station staff have long nicknamed House Mouse, and the assignment carries no implied hierarchy at all. In an environment this isolated, competence and reliability matter more than title, because everyone's safety, every single day, genuinely depends on everyone else doing their specific job correctly. The mechanic who lets a snow vehicle's engine freeze overnight, and the cook who miscounts a year's food supply, create the exact same category of crisis for the entire community, regardless of which job pays more back in the country either of them came from. Food itself becomes a quiet, constant undertaking of its own. With only a narrow window each summer when ships and aircraft can reliably reach the continent, most stations plan an entire year's food supply more than 12 months in advance, calculated down to the calorie, because there is no corner store to fall back on if the math runs short. Nearly everything arrives frozen, dried, or canned. Fresh produce, when it does arrive on early season flights, is treated as a genuine event rather than a routine grocery delivery. People at multiple stations have described the arrival of fresh fruit and vegetables, nicknamed freshies, as one of the most anticipated moments of the entire changeover season. Some of the larger stations, McMurdo and the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station among them, maintain small hydroponic greenhouses specifically to offset that scarcity, tucked away in rooms with no windows, running entirely on artificial light. The value of those greenhouses isn't measured only in lettuce and herbs. Researchers who study isolated environments have noted that the sensory experience of humidity, soil, and living green plants provides a measurable psychological benefit in places where the outside world offers nothing but white and blue for months at a time. A small, engineered antidote to an environment that otherwise gives the human nervous system almost nothing familiar to hold on to. The isolation itself follows its own calendar, one governed entirely by light rather than clocks. During the Antarctic summer, the sun doesn't rise and set in any conventional sense at high latitudes. It simply circles continuously above the horizon, day after day, for months at a stretch. Stations issue blackout curtains as standard equipment, because without them, the body's internal clock has almost nothing left to anchor a normal sleep cycle. Then, as autumn arrives, the sun drops beneath the horizon for what will be the final time until spring, often marked at larger stations by a formal sunset dinner. A small, deliberate ritual acknowledging that the light is about to disappear completely for months. What follows is the polar night, 4 to 6 months depending on latitude, with no sunlight at all, broken only by moonlight, starlight, and the shifting curtains of the aurora australis overhead. Crews describe this period as a kind of forced introspection, the pace of station life slowing to match the darkness outside, punctuated by a small number of deeply meaningful communal traditions. Chief among them midwinter, celebrated on June 21st, the exact midpoint of the long polar night, when isolated stations across the entire continent independently mark the same day with feasts, handmade gifts exchanged among crewmates, and, where satellite links allow it, brief messages of solidarity sent to other stations hundreds or thousands of kilometers away, each one just as cut off, just as far into the dark, celebrating the same quiet milestone alone together. None of this is incidental. Every one of these details, the greenhouse, the blackout curtains, the shared chores, the midwinter feast, exists because the people who plan life on this continent have learned, often through hard experience, that surviving Antarctica physically is only half the challenge. The other half is psychological, and it's treated with a level of institutional seriousness that few other workplaces on Earth would think to apply. Prospective station personnel typically undergo psychological screening before deployment, evaluated specifically for their capacity to handle prolonged isolation, close quarters, and the particular strain of living inside a small community with no ability to simply leave if a conflict or a bad mood becomes too much to bear. Once winter isolation actually begins and the last flight departs, that screening gives way to whatever structure the community can build for itself. Gyms, small libraries, hobby workshops, movie nights, the occasional themed dinner, all of it existing specifically to give people something to hold on to besides the work and the dark. Step back from any single station, and a pattern emerges that connects all of them despite how different their specific challenges are. Vostok exists because an unbearable cold happened to preserve an irreplaceable climate record. Halley 6 exists because an unstable ice shelf forced engineers to build a station that could move rather than merely endure. Concordia exists because a genuinely alien level of isolation turned out to be scientifically priceless for understanding how humans might one day survive the trip to Mars. And Rogozov's Night in 1961 exists in the record precisely because it captures, in the starkest possible terms, what happens when Antarctica's defining condition, the complete absence of outside help, collides directly with an ordinary human body's ordinary vulnerability to failure. Every one of these stories describes people choosing to stay inside a set of conditions that offer no natural reason for a human being to remain, and then building, piece by piece, the physical and social infrastructure that makes staying possible anyway. That's the real subject sitting underneath every fact in this story. Antarctica was never going to be a place people simply visited and adapted to, the way travelers adapt to a new city's customs or climate. It required something closer to invention, a version of daily life built from nothing, on ground that offers no food, no shelter, no breathable margin for careless error, and, on the Brunt ice shelf at least, no guarantee that the ground itself will even stay where you left it. Roughly 4,000 people are living inside that invention right now, this week, on a continent with no cities and no permanent residents, proving, station by station, that human life doesn't require hospitable conditions nearly as often as it requires a good enough reason to build them anyway. There's a quiet detail worth sitting with, buried inside nearly everything covered here. Almost none of what makes Antarctic life possible is about heroism in the dramatic sense. It's about maintenance. It's a mechanic thawing a frozen engine block for hours before a single repair can begin. It's a cook accounting for every calorie a full year in advance. It's a station physically climbing its own hydraulic legs each year just to stay above the snow. Survival here isn't one big act of courage. It's thousands of small, repeated acts of care, performed by people who understood, going in, that in this specific place, competence is the only form of safety that actually exists. So here's the question worth carrying with you after this ends. If the people willing to live at the bottom of the world can build a functioning, caring community out of nothing but ice, darkness, and each other, what does that say about the excuses the rest of us use for not doing the same, somewhere far less extreme? This documentary draws on verified scientific, historical, and engineering reporting about real Antarctic research stations, personnel, and events, including Vostok Station, Halley 6, Concordia Station, McMurdo Station, and the 1,961 self-appendectomy performed by Dr. Leonid Rogozov at Novolazarevskaya Station. No fictional characters have been introduced. All named individuals, places, and events are drawn from documented sources.